Now is an opportune time to return to the idea of our toolbox. You recall a few lectures ago we introduced the idea of functionalism and told you that we use that as a tool, pick it up out of our box, tinker with myths when we ran into something that we needed some help with, and see how that worked and put it back in our box, and eventually we'd start to fill that box up. Well, I want to add another tool to our toolbox with this lecture, and that's the tool of structuralism. Structuralism. It comes to us from a man named Claude Lévi-Strauss. His dates are 1908 to 2009, a towering figure in the last century, of pivotal importance in the field of anthropology, also important in lots of other fields, psychology, sociology, literary studies, and surely also in the study of myth. What the structuralists are interested in is, as you would guess from the name, structures of things. And sometimes people will immediately start thinking about the structure of cultural forms or structure of narratives or that kind of a thing. But we need to start with a first structure in order to get a grip on what they're telling us, and that's the structure of this thing, the human mind. Structuralists notice that all of human culture is the product of this thing, and therefore it should reflect the structure of the thing that produced it. How then does the human mind work? Well, Lévi-Strauss, in an incredibly prescient kind of observation, said that the most salient characteristic of how we process information as human beings with this amazing organ that we have, the mode by which this organ works the way it does at its most core elementary level, is a mode of binaries. It works according to on-off, yes-no, pairs of opposites that we use to structure our basic understanding of the world. All the other more complex forms of understanding that we have are the result of extra binaries layered on top of binaries. So, for example, some folks will say, well, not everything is black and white. Yeah, indeed, there's lots of shades of gray, but every single shade of gray is made up of certain amounts of black and certain amounts of white. And as if we needed any more proof that a binary language can encode lots of cultural information, well, my goodness, look at the format we're working in right now. It would be impossible to do what we're doing right now if a binary language wasn't capable of carrying very subtle messages. In this case, we've got a lot of information that's coming through the sounds. It's being encoded into binary language, sent out over wires through the internet to your speakers. The light that's being emitted from our studio here going into the camera lens, made into a binary code and sent out to you. So we, living in the computer age that we do, have seen this very prescient observation of Claude Lévi-Strauss in the middle of the last century proved absolutely true, that binary languages are indeed capable of very subtle kinds of expressions. So Lévi-Strauss was really interested in this. What he said was the moment of binary origination of information in the human mind. Now let's take a thought experiment, one that Lévi-Strauss himself did not do but might be illustrative. Think of a human infant. Its world is probably a pretty rudimentary one. We'll let our colleagues out there in the infant psychology make this picture much more complex. But imagine the infant's world that is at some point in its life notices that there's this creature out there that seems to have eyes and has emotional responses and engages with the infant and brings food and brings sounds and all kinds of fascinating things. And when that figure is around, the infant's life seems to be enriched and wonderful and quite exciting and interesting. And then sometimes that figure's gone. My goodness, what just happened? The world is now all of a sudden a completely different place. That figure that was there is now all of a sudden gone. Well, what have we just experienced? Lévi-Strauss and the structuralists would tell us we have here hit on a core anchoring binary of an infant experience. That is, sometimes there is mommy and sometimes there is not mommy. That core binary is an experiential moment that lies at the center of an expression of an obviously very rich and complex set of ideas. But it starts as its origination and its expression in that kind of rudimentary form. Now, all of cultural stuff according to the structuralists, is going to be expressed. At its core, it's going to have some binary opposition that is coming through, no matter how complex and elegant and rich and strange and subtle and nuanced the story might be. Our myths, at their core, all of them, are going to have some binary opposition that's driving them forward. And if you'll have a look at our friend over here, you'll realize that, yes, indeed, we have already snuck in a structuralist reading in our class. When we had a look at books 9 through 12 and claimed that what we saw was a set of myths anchored around a pair of opposite ideas between what counts as food and what counts as not being food, we were indeed doing a structuralist reading. Now, let's go back and reverse engineer that just a little bit and try to figure out how it is that structuralism goes about its work. First of all, a structuralist is not going to be interested in the temporal diachronic dimensions of a myth. The way a narrative unfolds, the back and forth of the time as it goes forward, the diachronic dimension of things is not of interest to them. Instead, they're interested in the structural pieces, the atoms that make up the molecule of the narrative. They break them apart and say, okay, which of these is a representation of one side of a binary, and which of these is a representation of another side of the binary. The order in which they come, the sequence of events in a narrative, that's not something that a structuralist really necessarily cares about. Instead, it's just which aspects, which parts of the narrative reflect one theme and which parts of the narrative reflect the opposite theme. Okay? Secondly, a structuralist is interested in the myth and makes the claim that a myth will have a meaning, not insofar as its particular details give us some complex expression of some cultural form, but instead in the relationships among these details. So we're not going to look at how it is that the voyage of Odysseus moves from one kind of culture to a different kind of culture to another kind of culture, or how he gets involved in the relationships that he does with the different kind of people and creatures that he runs across as he's making his voyage. But instead, we're going to look at the relationships among those features. How does the one feature over here relate to the other feature over there? And you can see, as we've done in the reading of food and not food, it's not so much what is being eaten or not eaten in one spot and what is being eaten or not eaten in another spot. It's that distinction between something that's okay to eat and something that's not, that's the one that's the most important thing. So the relationship among the items in the story is the most important thing, not the details of any particular element in the story. Now, there's going to be, for a structuralist, a certain kind of universality that's reflected in myth. But the universality is not going to have to do with the specific details of the themes that are talked about. So some people, when they look for universalities, will say, oh yes, all human beings think of water in X way, or all human beings code the sun as being a certain kind of symbol. The structuralist, when the structuralist goes through a process of pressing toward universals, will always do this not with that sort of single, looking at a single item and talking about it as having some specific meaning, as if there's like a dictionary of symbols or something like that. Instead, what they claim is that human beings tend to put the same pairs in opposition from culture to culture to culture. And that's where we're going to look to find the universality of them. What kinds of pairs of opposition are we going to find in myths? Well, according to the structuralists, we're going to find some that are consistent across many different cultures. This leads us to our next point. What counts as a structuralist binary pair? Well, what a structuralist winds up doing almost always is hunting for some pair of opposition that is anchored in some biological part of our experience of being human. It's not going to be a structuralist pair based on a complex cultural form, something that resides in the very specific nuances of how one culture negotiates its way through the question of being human. It's going to be a binary that's anchored in basic, fundamental human experience in at the level of our biological selves. So, for example, things like food and not food. That's a kind of example of the binary pair that a structuralist goes to, has a biological dimension to it. Questions about habitat, what kind of environment do people live in and thrive in? Questions about reproduction, a basic biological process. These are going to be fertile ground, pardon the pun with reproduction, fertile ground for finding binary pairs of oppositions that structuralists are interested in. Things like kinship relationships. So as human beings, we come from somewhere, and we have mothers and we have fathers, and we try to find relationships among all those groups. There are also things like siblings and cousins and aunts and uncles. These kinship relationships get expressed in universally across human cultures, and this is a point at which the structuralist is going to start to get interested in. So biological pairs of oppositions, or the pairs of oppositions we're going to be most interested in as structuralists, are going to be anchored in some biological aspect of what it is to be human. Final point about our oppositions. For a structuralist, the opposition between the two things that we're looking at does not reconcile. It's not as though the myth is made in order to happily bring these two binary pairs of opposites together. Well, gosh, no. Remember what happened in our previous reading of the myths in books, stories in books 9 through 12 of the Odyssey. We're not talking about making it okay for food and not food to kind of blend together. No, the whole point for the structuralist is the anxiety that the possibility of these two things coming together creates. These binary pairs of oppositions are things that you and I, as humans, declare and insist are true. Sometimes we run into experiences where that insistence of truth runs up against a question mark. And we say to ourselves, wait a minute, maybe these two opposite things are actually not entirely opposite. Maybe they come together. Maybe there's some gray area in between them. Maybe it's not black and white. When the binary pair is threatened, and there is some reconciliation between the two, that's just when the anxiety comes. And the anxiety for the structuralist is what is behind the myth. It's like an oyster being bothered by a grain of sand, and when that oyster is bothered by a grain of sand, that's when you get the pearl. Structuralist says when a human being walks through its life with a very stable pair of oppositions anchored to its biological self that it thinks are a core piece of what it is to be human, and then all of a sudden there's some piece of its reality that says that, that binary pair of opposition that you think is a very firm, strong, hard and fast distinction, well, here's some examples where it seems a little funny or a little bit strange. That causes anxiety. And that anxiety is then filled in. It's not really papered over and it doesn't disappear, but it's filled in by a story. When people get nervous, they talk. Same thing is happening, according to a structuralist, when myths are being created. When we're getting nervous about whether the distinction between food and not food could really actually be one where there's a lot of gray area, we start telling stories about places where that gray area is being exhibited, and then yes, indeed, it gets overcome, and we get reminded of the importance of keeping these two things separate. So the structuralist is not going to go about trying to reconcile the opposites. So how to be a structuralist? What are you going to do? Well, there's a basic thing that you want to do, which is you go binary hunting. You head out and you try to read a myth that's in front of you. First of all, get rid of the narrative arc. Toss out the logic of the story. Look at all the features that are in the story. What are the elements that make it up? Break them apart. Try to find columns in which they line up, and find columns that have opposite dimensions into which we can pair all the pieces of the myth. The best structuralist reading is the one that provides two opposite categories into which the largest number of features in the myth can fit, and that does so in a way that leaves no remainder. So we explain all the important pieces of the myth, all the most important pieces of the myth, through our two categories. We find places for all the features of the story. These are anchored in opposite pieces of what it is to be human from a biological inflection, and then we claim that we have found the myth. There's a kind of ta-da moment when you're a structuralist is, yeah, I figured it out. This is what's making this myth tick. Unlike a functionalist, for a structuralist, there is a kind of secret key at the core of any myth, and that key is a binary pair of oppositions. And to read the myth, to interpret it properly, is to find the key. Key is going to be in the form of the right pair of binaries. Now, some people are going to say, well, wait a minute, does that mean that there's one single pair of binary oppositions at the core of any given myth? Well, for structuralists, the answer is pretty much yes. There is going to be a single pair. It could be that there are several different kinds of pairs that work pretty well, but the structuralists will claim that there is some core anchoring one at the base of all of them. And when one person proposes one pair of opposition, another person proposes a different one, they start and they have a conversation. And they say, okay, you think it's this, well, this other thing seems to work pretty well. And then there's a conversation where they say, actually what we realize is that there's some further anchoring pair of binaries at the very core of both of these statements of ours. A conversation about which binary is the most fundamental is the way we evaluate how a structuralist reading works. Okay, so all of myth, according to this structuralist reading, is going to reflect this kind of opposition. This opposition is traced back to the most important structure that the structuralist is interested in. That's what's up here. And myths as products of what's up here are going to reflect how what's up here works. So go off, be structuralists. Go binary hunting when that tool is useful to you, and when it isn't, put it back in the box and pull out another one. Maybe it's going to be functionalism, and maybe one of the other ones we introduce as the course goes along.